ahead and pray. Lord God, we are grateful that we have this chance to be together today, and we thank you for the blessing that is to us. We, Lord, invite you to direct us and lead us by your Spirit so that the time we spend together will be profitable and would indeed encourage us, Lord, in the callings you've given to us all. Thank you for this time, then, and we commit it to you in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Good. Well, welcome all today. Today we are continuing our journey through T.F. Torrance's book, The Doctrine of Grace in the Apostolic Fathers, looking today at the Epistles of Ignatius. There are traditionally 7 that are discussed. He engages 6 of them in this text, so we have no explanation why that one is missing. There are some that are pseudepigraphically in a broader list of, I think, 15, maybe what some people would list as the most, but this has been whittled down to the ones that Torrance at least engaged as being worthy of engaging the question about the nature of grace in the Apostolic Fathers. So we have today with us the amazing Jerome Van Kuiken to walk us through this chapter and give us insight into, Torrance in his time. And again, this is the early young Torrance. And I'm grateful for Jerome pointing out some of the later Torrance as we go through this discussion. There's a handout, if you haven't seen it, that's at the Torrance website. So that will be helpful data for people to look at. There it is. It's a fairly long section, and some people like Ken has read through it all, and Jerome, I'm sure you've read through these letters as well, just to get your own impression of what it is that's going on. So Jerome, if you could just maybe begin by just giving kind of, when you read through the epistles themselves before you read Torrance, or maybe it wasn't before Torrance, what was kind of your impression of these letters kind of standing on their own without a critique? I mean, except for your own critique, maybe.
Right. I think that what Ken was talking about right before we began recording is very important about Torrance's purpose in publishing this doctoral thesis. And that was, Ken said, his focus was really not on making a name for himself as a student of the Apostolic Fathers. The focus was on commending a particular conception of grace, a Bartian conception of grace, if you will, that would be radical enough to provide a foundation for rebuilding Europe after World War II. And I think that's an important insight as we approach this. It reminds me of Jason Radcliffe's book on Torrance's use of the Church Fathers later on in Torrance's career, when, for instance, his reading of the Cappadocians really makes more sense when you recognize that he's in debate with John Zizioulas. So there's the question of how much of this is actually there in Basel and Nissen and Nazianzen, and how much of it is really present in Torrance's own day in 2 different conceptions of the structuring of the Trinity. When I read Ignatius himself, I don't find the problems that Torrance does, and I think some of those critiques are pretty evident in the asides that I make in the handout. I would say, Ignatius is on his way to die. He is under a great deal of pressure as someone who's about to be martyred in a setting that is very far from any sort of Christendom type of setting. And so I think it takes a great, it would have taken a great deal of imagination, of sympathetic imagination, to have placed oneself as a European Christian in the mid-20th century into the mental context of somebody like Ignatius, who lives long before Christendom and who is about to be executed for his faith.
So Ignatius is writing kind of mid-second century. So it's with Constantine 312 or so that Christendom comes into practice. So this is an era that's after the initial writers. Paul, particularly, TF's going to always refer to Paul kind of as a litmus test of, do you have this right? He is the measuring stick, in a sense, the can with the canon, as you will bring up later. So, I mean, the question of the history of the church reading Ignatius, is there something about the continuity of teaching that came from the original writings of the gospel writers, Paul and so forth, that there is an interest in what is continuing on and where are things going astray? And Torrance is particularly concerned, under the guidance of Bart, to understand how grace worked itself out. Is that kind of the context in which we're saying this is important for the history of theology, and hence for Torrance, because it is the development of something, and something, as I was traveling in Italy and Greece, as I found that after a long time, things get buried over with silt or bad doctrine or something, so that it's hard sometimes to find the original. And when you do find it, it can be in rubble and requires some archaeological interpretation. So in a sense, you're saying Torrance is writing centuries later, and there's potentially a lot of rubble in his own mind and a lot of rubble in the minds of those who have been interpreting or not paying attention to the works of Ignatius. And so we're sitting now with Torrance, and he's trying to show himself to be a true theologian, and he's wanting to become an interpreter for us, a tour guide, as it were, that is actually shaping him in the process as well. And as you point out at the end of your talk, he does move in a more gracious direction, shall we say, over time.
Right. You have three different aspects of his current context when he's writing this. One is Oscar Kuhlmann is heavily influential on this, and Kuhlmann is Lutheran. And so you can see the use of Paul as the litmus test for what is New Testament teaching is very Lutheran. The description here that I've provided from the preface of, under the gracious impingement of Christ through the Spirit, there's a glad spontaneity about the New Testament believer. He's not really concerned to ask questions about ethical practice. He acts before the questions can be asked. He's caught up in the overwhelming love of Christ. That kind of language is exactly what Luther has in his preface to the book of Romans when he's describing a lively faith, the difference that faith makes in one's life. So I think there are definite echoes of Luther and a Lutheran perspective here. Another aspect of this immediate context is you have Bultmann on the scene, who's interpreting the Gospel of John and a lot of the high Christological material in the New Testament as being influenced by Gnosticism, the Gnostic Redeemer myth. And so Torrance's frequent appeals to Gnosticism to explain where Ignatius is getting some of this language of the pleroma, the fullness, emphasis on knowledge, all those sorts of things. That Gnostic explanation is in the water there on the European continent at the time. More recent interpreters would tend, of course, to push back against that. And then the third aspect is this is long before Vatican II. And so there's very much of this strongly, this pushback against Catholicism and the tendency to postulate an early Catholicism already there in books of the New Testament like Ephesians, like the pastoral epistles and so forth. And so you see some of these elements at play in Torrance's reading of Ignatius.
Yeah, and particularly the moralism of Catholicism, probably that bent towards legalism, kind of, that he's going to have as a constant theme through this book.
Yeah, and the instrumentalizing of grace.
Yeah,
as well.
Good. Well, that's very helpful. Those lenses to see that are, in a sense, providing for Torrance something that maybe, I don't know how critical he would be able to be at this point. I mean, obviously one develops those ways of looking at people and their positions, and one has to move with them. I mean, as part of
Mhm.
Carrie Montgomery or Carrie Magruder talking about the history of science is it's not a fixed story. It's a continually changing
Mhm.
story. And you have to say, who are the voices in a time? How do those develop and become engaged and change over time? And that is certainly, we're sitting right in the middle of that with this work with Torrance. So thank you for that really helpful piece. Dwayne, I see your hand up there. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, actually, I just, because I've looked at this material like you guys a lot on and off. The thing that strikes me about his writing is that he does, like, because of the anti-Semitic context, the anti-Judaizing context, there's no quotation of the Old Testament. And his use of altar and other, his religious language is devoid of the continuation of what Paul is talking about, where you look at, a guy like we talked about Irenaeus and Polycarp, whatever, if they were taught by John, you figured there'd be some type of access to the Old Testament or just even quotation, because he quotes in generic, the prophet said this about Jesus fulfilling scripture, whatever, but he quotes no scripture, which there's a lot of irony there.
Well,
Yeah.
he actually does quote from Proverbs. The righteous man is his own accuser. And then in his letter to the Trallians, let's see, where is this? Yeah, chapter 8, verse 2, there's an apparent quotation or semi-quotation from Isaiah 53, or Isaiah 52, verse 5, rather. So there is some use of the Old Testament there. Of course, once again, we have to remember he is on his way to die. He doesn't have any literature. He doesn't have any scrolls accessible to him. He's writing these letters under a great deal of internal pressure and without access to documents. And so I would, again, given his situation, I would want to read him as charitably as possible.
That is reading Ignatius
Ignatius, yeah.
as graciously as possible. Is that what you're saying?
The first
Yes.
thing that struck me is how drenched in Pauline rhetoric Ignatius writes. And Tom picks that up almost right away. It says, compared to Clement, who's Roman and has not apparently steeped himself in the Pauline epistles anywhere near as much. Corinthians and the letter to the Romans, yes, but much of the rest of it, not yet. But Ignatius from Antioch is steeped in it, and he's been preaching from it and expounding on it for years. And I will say he's not alone. Everywhere he goes, he has 4 or 5 other bishops with him, carrying his chains to help him lighten his load. He's and also talking to him. And every time they stop, they gather a group of Christians around, and he sermonizes. And do not underestimate the prodigious memory of the ancients. There is a passage where Athanasius is out in the desert. He's in exile. He cannot return to Alexandria. It's his 3rd time, and he had to leave in a hurry. He didn't have a change of underwear. He just had to get out. But they sent him a letter and said, is the Holy Spirit God, or is it another thing? And he to Serapion, and he dictates a long letter to Serapion, and he says, well, when we see in Genesis, and he rattles off the quotations, and then in Exodus, and he rattles off the quotation, and then he goes right through the whole of the Septuagint, rattling off all the quotations having to do with the Holy Spirit as God, with no notes, with no glossaries, no dictionaries, no concordances. That's just how much they remembered. And from what I saw of education in antiquity, that's Maru, I think, that's what they were trained to do. Because a rhetoric needed to be able to get up in front of a crowd and bind them with poetry and rhetoric with no notes. So the reason why he does not need to quote Paul word for word, is that he's giving the gist of Paul, he's approximating Paul. So if he misses a use of Paul's language, he's not going to catch that right away. He's just going to assume that he's quoting him correctly, and everybody around him is going to assume he's quoting him correctly. That it's as vibrant and vivid and emphatic as it is, makes him all the more appealing. I found him much more appealing than Clement. I had to read Clement standing up, or I would have dropped over asleep. But Ignatius, it was quite compelling. I'll save my criticisms for later, but at least we can say that Ignatius, there was a reason why his stuff was kept and repeated and used within the developing Catholic Church. This was pretty good stuff the first time out, and it aged well. And his martyrdom only climaxed that. But like Paul, when he's being hauled off to Rome, he gets to various capital cities and other places. He stops and he sits there for months. They're waiting for the wind to change. They're waiting for the weather to change. They're waiting for a credit to come in to pay the rent to the captain to pilot the boat. There's all sorts of, his martyrdom is being delayed for months, if not years, until Paul finally gets to Rome. And Ignatius, I'm not sure we even have recorded where he was finally martyred. The point was, he was so happy that everybody else knew they were going to die, but they didn't know when. Ignatius at least knew he was going to die, and he was going to die pretty darn soon. And the main element of, I think, of his religious dynamic is he does not want to fail before his death. And that Torrance picks up on that. Says, where does this anxiety come from if you're a faithful Christian? And if you ask Clement, it's just because the whole of life is one long trial. If you fail, you lose your salvation. Ignatius is not supposed to have that conditional salvation. It's supposed to be like Paul's, given, completed, once and for all. And yet he says, please don't intercede for me. Now I know I'm going to die. I'm going to make it. I'm going to get over the line. I'm going to win the prize. But if you get me off and I got to go back to Antioch, I don't know what's going to happen.
Okay. Did you want to respond to that at all, Jerome?
Well, I would say that there are places in Paul's writings where he expresses an if, a conditionality as well. 1 Corinthians 9, the end of that chapter, where he talks about how he disciplines his body like an athlete, so that, having preached to others, he himself may not become a castaway or disqualified. And then he launches into the very next chapter talking about the Israelites who came out of Egypt but then failed to make it into the promised land. But the other thing that I would say is that in Paul's case, most of his letters are not being written with the sense of impending martyrdom hanging over him. You have 2 Corinthians, where he's just come out of a situation that was incredibly stressful to him. And so he does talk about how he wasn't sure if he was going to make it or not, remain alive, that sort of thing. But most of his letters, Paul's letters, are written over a broader period of time than Ignatius's letters are. And it does strike me that when you read some of the other literature of people who are facing martyrdom or have a sense that they may be martyred, that you do run into some of these extremes of anxiety, of worry about loss of nerve. Those kinds of things do crop up. And I think it can be difficult for us in our situation to understand that pressure, that mentality. It did strike me that in Ignatius's letter to the Romans, where he's begging them not to do him a false kindness by trying to get him released. Don't, he says, the devil's already trying to dissuade me. Don't do his work for him. What that struck me as is having some parallel to when Jesus rebukes Peter, because Peter's trying to dissuade Jesus from going to the cross. Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you. And Jesus rebukes Peter quite strongly, get behind me, Satan. You don't have in mind the things of God, but a human perspective. And then you see later on in the Garden of Gethsemane, a scene from all three of the Synoptic Gospels that's quite embarrassing in terms of the heroic literature of the ancient world. Here is, Jesus, who is struggling in the garden with his Father's will and begging, if it's possible, take this cup from me. That doesn't, that doesn't play well with a sort of heroic Greco-Roman idea of facing death with a stiff upper lip and undaunted courage. So I do think that there is something in the New Testament itself. There are passages that would connect with the sort of situation that Ignatius is dealing with. And I think as well, it's been suggested that his if he were to be released, it might suggest to the people around him, the people in Syria, as well as the churches, that, well, maybe he got out of death by making some sort of compromise. And so it's not simply that he's worried that he might lose his nerve, and that he has his normal fear of death or anxiety of death, but there's also a real concern that if the Roman Christians somehow bail him out, that it could destroy his reputation and consequently the reputation of the gospel.
Right. Bryden, you've had your hand up for a while there. Do you want to go ahead and throw in there?
It's a very simple and single point to do with memory. As you know, I've lived a fair bit of my life in Central Africa, and I think it's true very much of other cultures other than our own rather flippant contemporary culture, if I could call it that, where we think everything is accessible somewhere else. Colin Chapman was a missionary to the Middle East, and I'll never forget, he said very simply that when he was in Beirut at the university there, he gave a talk to a bunch of Christians and hangers-on on the edges. And it resonates completely with my own cultural experiences, because somebody came up to him 3 days later and said, halfway through your talk, you said ... And then you said ... And then I think you might have meant ... But you said, and this thing went on for, 3 or 4 minutes from a talk that Colin Chapman gave. And it was almost a tape recorder running back with his own commentary by this particular individual student. And I think and that's 20th century now in the Middle Eastern culture. And I mean, I see Ken nodding his head. I mean, we just don't get it. I sort of get it because of my exposure myself to an alternative culture, but we just don't get the kind of incredible memorizing that they did. And if you didn't recite the whole Pentateuch by the time you had your bar mitzvah, well, mate, you weren't there. End of discussion. I've stayed with a rabbi in B'nai Brak, for goodness sake, that Orthodox suburb of Tel Aviv. It's frightening stuff. Anyway, that's enough from me.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, the whole thing of being able to get into the cultures of original context, of Torrance's context, and even to be attuned to our own context. There are multi-strata, to use Torrance's term, that are going on here. And our experience, of course, is ours is the dominant one. It's hard to see into these other layers. But thank you for that. So I'm going to go to your handout here, Jerome. And so you have an introductory section there where you're wanting to make the point of the constant use that Torrance is going to want to make, which is a New Testament definition that God's unmerited gift of himself in Christ is kind of focal. And then you have some key points on that. So this is setting kind of the standard by which he's going to judge Ignatius. Do you want to say just a little bit about the standard that you're wanting to imply in that opening section?
Right. I think as far as it goes, the definition of grace that he's using, God's unmerited gift of himself in Christ, is perfectly fine. I have no qualms about that. I do wonder when he does give the concession that there is discussion of rewards and punishments in the New Testament. But when he makes this contrast, reward is always regarded in terms of blessing, not in terms of achievement, emphatically not in terms of achievement. I do have some questions about how that squares with certain passages of Scripture. The other thing is that because he is so Paul focused, Torrance is so Paul focused here, he'll grant that there are a couple of passages in the Catholic epistles, or excuse me, one in Hebrews and one in James, that correlate charis with the Spirit. And then Torrance actually misses a third passage, and that's in the book of Revelation. I should mention the book of Revelation gets startlingly little airtime in this work of Torrance's. It's only cited once, at least according to the index. So hopefully, later on when he read through it multiple times to prepare his material on the Apocalypse today, he made up for that deficit. But here, at least, there's really an underuse of the book of Revelation. But at any rate, you do have these three passages, at least in the New Testament, that do correlate charis with the Holy Spirit. And so he sees this as potentially problematic, as setting up a Catholicizing trend.
And you use the word anti-moralism in that section
Yes.
under your box there. The Spirit is, under the gracious impingement of Christ through the Spirit, is a glad spontaneity. So he wants spontaneity, not directed by any compulsion of the church as a whole or the bishop in particular, or kind of guidelines or teaching of the apostles to be set as a condition. I mean, it's an anti-conditional format that he's really wanting to propose. And he feels like Ignatius misses that.
Yeah, and that really plays into, throughout his career, and this has been an ongoing debate and discussion among Torrance scholars and students of Torrance and so forth, about the place of ethics in Torrance. And so here early on, you see a theme that recurs across his career, that he's very reticent to speak directly to the issue of ethics. He would much prefer that to be guided by the Spirit in spontaneous ways. But I do point out that, well, the Apostle Paul, at least, is not reticent to give ethical advice. And, there are New Testament believers, despite what Torrance says, there are New Testament believers who actually do ask ethical questions and who desperately do need some ethical instruction.
Yes, well, it was J.B. Torrance who said all of Paul's letters are structured with the indicatives of grace that then are followed by the imperatives of law as an outworking of grace.
Right.
So that, here's who God is, what he's done in Christ. Now act like it is the short form of that.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of the logic that is preceded and the nature of what then follows for the life of the church as well as particular persons, and that it's systemic for Paul. And how well does Ignatius reflect that?
Mm-hmm.
So the nature of his opening statement in this chapter is, of all the early church fathers, it is the figure of Ignatius which comes nearest to the apostolic picture as we find it in the New Testament. So, I mean, he's wanting to put his first foot forward to say there is something here that would at least lend one to think that the nature of what's going to follow in these letters, and he is particularly looking at the nature of grace, that the language, as Ken pointed out, sounds very, very Pauline. It sounds, there are echoes everywhere of a language that is borrowed there. But Torrance is going to question the content of what follows as to whether it really stays with a form of grace that would reflect Paul particularly as the one who's informing the meaning of the words as they show up in Ignatius.
Right. And the other factor in there is, I note that Torrance seems to have reduced the apostolic picture simply to Paul, which sounds like a rather Lutheran move. But Ignatius also shows evidence of awareness of Matthew's gospel. And if we were to expand the apostolic picture to include at least Matthew too, it might help to counterbalance some of the concerns that Torrance expresses. And as we'll see later on, Matthew's gospel actually uses the language of justification in a way that fits with one of Ignatius's uses.
Right. And the question of Luther and the use of the word law, I mean, we know about Barth's switching of going from law and grace to grace and law. Alan Torrance, when I was in New Zealand, talked about Bonhoeffer, who was Lutheran in his roots, having a Lutheran hangover of a kind of legalism.
Mm-hmm.
But the question, is that really what's going on? Or could you read it more through a Barthian set of eyes and say, no, there is something that is there of grace? Douglas Campbell is continually criticizing N.T. Wright as having a Lutheran kind of gospel, and he's meaning by that a conditionality. So I hear Luther and conditionality being made an overarching sequencing of the nature of gospel. And it's a little bit in the reading of even what we're looking at here. To what degree, I mean, Luther is somebody who we tend to think of as a reformer, as bringing grace into focus in a sense. So, how do we wrestle with Luther as the eyes that come to these texts and are part of the voices of what Torrance is looking at to assess, evaluate what it is that he's reading here?
Yeah. Well, I would say that part of Luther's legacy is to associate law so closely with what was going on in late medieval Catholicism in his day. And this gets us into the whole, old perspective versus new perspective and apostolic or apocalyptic Paul and all that range of discussion. But at this stage of Torrance's career, it seems to me like his attempt to paint Ignatius as early Catholic fits with a Lutheran reading of law is legalism, is the bad thing that we're trying to get away from, and grace sets us free from that. Yeah. As opposed to a more reform perspective, even with Calvin having the multiple uses of the law, and one of them is to guide the Christian life.
Yeah.
There are elements of that in Lutheranism, but if you're talking in stereotypical terms, right, within Lutheranism, the tendency is to view the law more as something on the side of sin and the devil and death, as something to be set free from, whereas the Reformed have tended to have a more positive view of the law.
Good. And I'm just wanting to clarify really Torrance in his time as he's developing, and how we listen to his read of Luther and the kind of things coming from that, and the early Catholic inclinations that are there, which may be there, but that we allow Torrance to be developing as well, but we're listening to the kind of voices that might be informing the time, and to say, okay, we'll hold that tentatively rather than definitively, and continue to just allow the nature of the development of our own thought to follow by hearing, okay, there are influences that would cause concern, and we can listen to those concerns and keep listening and saying, do those change?
Yeah.
So Bryden, I see that hand up there. What do you got to say?
Oh, well, I just want to pick up on Jerome's comment about Matthew. Matthew is almost, in my mind anyway, from the research I've done, a Syrian Christian. And therefore, where is Syrian and where is its center of gravity? The answer is Antioch. And it doesn't surprise me at all that if Matthew's gospel is extant by the time Ignatius is around, then Matthew gets a real Guernsey, because, it's kind of a connection, a geographical connection, because that's where Matthew's writing from, the Jewish Christian diaspora. And I mean, I've done a lot of work on Matthew simply because I was ordained on the 21st of September. And everybody knows that's the feast of St. Matthew, don't they? And I mean, it's kind of interesting, these links that are deeply subconscious in people's brains. And anyway, thank you, Jerome, for what you said, because it kind of goes, maybe it's a guesstimate, it's a speculation, but it's got a bit of a thread there. That's enough.
Right. And he's certainly familiar with the sort of material that eventually makes it into Matthew's gospel. He talks about the star that appears when Jesus is born, that kind of thing.
Very good.
Yeah, if I could add one more, we went into something of the young TFT's intellectual influences prior to going to Basel, and it's the faculty at New College. It's H.R. McIntosh, it's William Manson, and he quotes William Manson many times in the course of this dissertation, because that whole notion of the radical liberation of the gospel in the emancipation of the gospel is Manson's take. And at this point, Tom is simply reproducing it because he finds that is what he found in Bott's take in the Epistle to the Romans and Church Dogmatics, Volume 1. He thinks he's on very solid ground here. That this is almost a traditional reading of the Apostolic Fathers, who I noted last time had become almost unknown in the church, except for obscure Catholic scholars still trying to find proof texts about the superiority of the Roman primacy and the origins of baptism and the origins of the Eucharist. Very much an in-house conversation going on among Catholics. It was for Tom, there was an element in being in the Church of Scotland in the 1930s, is that it was attempting to reunite with the Church of England. And if they did that, then they're going to have to do something about bishops. And they're going to have to do something about the Eucharist. They're going to have to do something about the validity of non-episcopal baptism. I mean, these are all living issues. And all of the scholarship going on at Oxford and Cambridge into the historic early church is being done through the huge publishing efforts of people like Adolf Harnack. They are dropping these huge volumes of early apostolic and post-apostolic and the Latin theology of the 2nd century, all pre-Augustinian stuff. That is the avalanche of Catholic, small c, but Catholic and historic materials that anybody who wants to say, I would like to see a union of the churches of England and the Church of Scotland, but I don't want it to be crypto-Catholic. I'm going to have to speak up now. I'm going to have to say, these are the grounds and terms on which some kind of a union might be achieved. And if you look at the stuff that Tom publishes from 1948, when this thing is published, or 1946, when this is published, to about 1956, half of it has to do with the ecumenical movement and the church union movement, and especially the status of clergy, the status of the sacraments, and the status of the it'll come to me in a moment. The things that baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. Eventually, the BAM document that comes out. All of this, it was vitally important to him. He was percolating on it when I was at New College, and he was very much concerned that yes, that we get real church union, but it be done on the basis of the gospel and not on the basis of lowest common denominator religion. And he was dismayed at how quickly people were willing to cheerfully give up 400 years of Protestant tradition because the Catholics said you had to, or we're going home and we're taking our sacraments with us. Goodbye. That's something that is underlying this turn to criticize Ignatius and his doctrine of the sacraments, his doctrine of the episcopacy, and his doctrine of the unity of the church. And I think that I'll throw it back to you, Jerome, because unity is a key theme in your handout here, and it's one that the people in this group have been talking about for months now. But that church unity, but on an apostolic, not on a strictly apostolic basis, but on a charismatic, evangelical basis, one that is genuinely ecumenical.
Right. And I want to go back to, I think all this leads into, just going back to your handout then, the first really from page 57 to page 77 is spent on three major themes that Torrance is going to engage. Again, he's attempting to play them out with regards to the nature of grace, but Christology, justification, and ecclesiology. So can you just briefly walk us through these 3 points with regards to how Torrance is unpacking them with regard to a proper or improper understanding of grace as related to Christology, justification, and ecclesiology?
Right. So, you have first is Christology, and very helpfully, Torrance points out that for Ignatius, this theme of union, of unity, is one that keeps recurring in multiple ways. There's the union between the Father and the Son. There's the union between faith and love. There's the union between spirit and flesh. Multiple iterations of this theme. And then there's the union of the church body under the bishop, the presbytery, the deacons, the whole church united under this church administration as well. So that is a key theme that keeps popping up from time to time throughout Ignatius's letters. And he sees it as the defense, the key defense against both schism and heresy.
So when there is grace, there isn't division. Is that, grace is set as almost an antonym to the nature of schism and division.
Right. Yeah. The favor that God has shown in Jesus Christ is meant to bind people together from all nations, from all walks of life, and bind them together in a common confession of Jesus Christ as Lord, and in a common life of love for one another. And so, and again, remembering that he's living long before Christendom, you have these tiny little congregations sprinkled across the Roman Empire, and they do not have a completed New Testament canon. They don't. What binds them together? Well, church administration is going to play a very crucial role in keeping these congregations together individually as individual congregations, and then in unity with their fellow congregations.
And the nature of this first part, though, is Christology. And again, Torrance is in some way acknowledging that Ignatius is not just going merely to the human, but that Christ is the one who, at some level, is the head of the church, and the nature of the work of the bishop is at some level to point to Christ. They can move away from that. But the grace is, in a sense, the way you're languaging it is almost like grace is the covenant
that is lived within, that Christ has offered, and the nature of our being in agreement with the will of God by living within the covenant is to be living in grace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which he departs. Torrance says that Ignatius departs from Paul's view on the cross, by which we're justified, on page 61. So he has some disagreement with the nature of the way this is lived out. And maybe that's where some of the conditionality that Torrance resists comes in.
There's that, and then there's also this language of Ignatius's constant language of "I'm not yet perfected. I'm only beginning to become a disciple." He refers to justification at least once, if not twice, as a future event, attaining to God. That kind of language. Ignatius associates his death with attaining to God, and so Torrance accuses Ignatius at those points of being un-Pauline, and then also semi-Gnostic, that he's bringing in Gnostic ideas.
Say a little bit more about the Gnostic piece, just for people who may not immediately be able to pull down Gnostic concepts as would be pertaining to this particular topic.
Right. So within Gnosticism, as it began to arise in the 2nd century, you have multiple pieces of it. One strand is the idea that Jesus is some sort of celestial being who did not really take human flesh as we have it, that he only appeared to be a human being. And so Ignatius pushes back against that multiple times, where he says, no, Jesus really was born of the Virgin Mary. He really did suffer and die under Pontius Pilate. He didn't just appear to be born. He didn't just appear to suffer and die. Those kinds of things. So in that area, that version of Gnosticism is called Docetism. And Ignatius is very clearly anti-docetic. So Torrance does not accuse Ignatius of falling into the docetic element of Gnosticism. But Ignatius does use the language of silence. He contrasts silence with the word. He talks about the pleroma, the fullness of God. And both of those, the language, the idea, the terminology of silence and the terminology of fullness or pleroma, are kind of Gnostic catchphrases. And then this idea of attaining to God, becoming like God, is also an idea that you'll find within Gnosticism, that the goal of life is to be set free from the flesh and from this earthly life, and our spirits can fly away home to the Most High God. Now, I'm going to push back against that and say the language of pleroma, the language of fullness, is already there in Paul, in Ephesians and in Colossians. He doesn't, Ignatius does not have to pull that from Gnosticism. The language of silence versus the word, you have Jesus being silent before Pontius Pilate. He's led as a lamb, you think of Isaiah 53, and he's led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And then if Ignatius is at all familiar with any of the material that is in our Gospel of John, and he does seem to show some familiarity with it, then you could think of, well, if Jesus is called the Word, then the idea of silence does, it's a legitimate contrast there with the Word. So I don't think that you need to posit Gnosticism as the source of this material in Ignatius. And even attaining to God, becoming like God, I've listed there in Philippians 3, 2 Peter 1, 1 John 3. You have this type of idea in the New Testament documents, including in Paul. Even Paul says, I'm not yet perfect, but I press towards the mark for the high calling of God in Christ Jesus to obtain the prize.
Yeah.
When I was at New College, there'd be, among the faculty, there would be these heart-barbed comments that it seemed like everybody in Germany was now suddenly finding Gnosticism because Rudolf Bultmann was finding Gnosticism. This is in the 1950s and 60s, and then the huge post-World War II archaeology, the discovery of troves of old Gnostic literature which completely reopened the subject. Tom didn't have any of that at hand in the 1940s. He's basing his stuff on what was known of Gnosticism from the 1600s and the 1700s in the Vatican libraries, and the stuff mediated by Eusebius, Irenaeus, the usual gang of suspects. And the faculty at New College were highly skeptical about exactly the things that, Jerome, you're pointing out, that these terms, simply because they appear in Gnostic literature and appear in John or Hebrews, or that is a, quote, Gnostic influence, and we have to kind of distance ourselves a bit, especially if we're going to now demythologize. Anything marked with Gnosticism needs to be weeded out. Is it? No. It was all there. And Tom made several points about going up to, rising up to the temple. It says this is not a Gnostic comment, it's a Jewish comment. When you're in Jerusalem, you have to go up to the temple. It's a physical fact. It's not a Gnostic phrase. So, and I don't know, I'm a little surprised. When I read Tom, and I'll have to reread it, it seemed to me he was defending Ignatius against any kind of Gnostic influences, that he was getting his vocabulary from the New Testament, not from the legends and myths and stories of the wandering prophets. The one who wanted to find Gnostic influence was Harnack, because now he could point to the Gnosticism and say, right here, right now, not even 150 years after Jesus' death, the church is flirting with heresy. It's compromised. It cannot stand. We're going to have to go through and purify all of our stuff, and in the process decatholicize it too. It was not a dispassionate commenter on these texts. It seemed to me that Torrance didn't see Gnosticism an active, willing adoption of Gnostic thought or principle in Ignatius. That was not his criticism of Ignatius. His criticism of Ignatius is that once having established the reality of the incarnation, the reality of the atonement, the reality of the physicality of the church, and all of that, he still could not clearly articulate how what Jesus did in his death gets transferred to us in our lives. He says the whole early church, he said, seemed to be bedazzled, bemused, mystified by an atonement that was transferred from God to humanity through the intercession of Jesus. They didn't seem to be able to articulate that. I'm sorry I don't have the page. If Jerome, if you'll take over, I'll go look for the page, because it had to do with very near the passage on the star appearing, because everybody was bedazzled and bemused by the star Folsom.
Right. He does, specifically on page 73, footnote 10, Torrance cites, for Gnostic influence in Ignatius, see Hilgenfeld, Schlier, and so forth. So he is willing, not in the docetic side of things. He's very clear that Ignatius is opposed to docetism, but he does specifically on page 73, not only in footnote 10, but also right before the final paragraph. This is evidence. The correlative to this is the church, which is united to Christ by his death and resurrection by means of baptism and the Eucharist, apparently, thus partaking of the divine pleroma and thought of as full of God. This is evidence of Gnostic influence, such as we find in 2nd Clement as well. So he is willing to ascribe Gnostic influence to Ignatius in some of these areas.
Yeah.
Again, the
But
nature of
and that may be hangover of Harnack at that point in his career. You see a similar sort of thing happening with early on. Young Torrance is very much opposed to any sort of language of theosis, and then he gets to talking to George Florovsky and comes around. And then in his WCC address, he even commends the idea of theosis as capable of being interpreted in a Reformed sense. So I think you do have Torrance maybe early on influenced by Harnack in some of these areas, and then moving away from that over time as he gets more into ecumenical dialogues.
Mhm. And the word fullness, you can see fullness as the fullness of life in Christ in a Pauline way. And you can see other people using the term as a completion of a spiritual path of working, so that the term is elastic, I think. And so
Right.
one has to be cautious to overread anything in at any of those points, right?
He's not criticizing Ignatius for using the terms. He's criticizing that the whole early church for using vocabulary like this to articulate the core of the mystery of the atonement when other language was available in the New Testament, especially in the letter to the Hebrews, that Jesus learns by suffering. So that the forgiveness, notice how he keeps saying, when is Ignatius going to get to forgiveness? Can we get to forgiveness, please? All of the language of atonement that the later church does develop and is not in Ignatius. He's saying that's why we find these Gnostic terms here in Ignatius. The church hasn't developed enough vocabulary that is biblical in order to be able to keep everything on the biblical side. I did not take it as a criticism, and I assume from the footnotes, and I did not have a chance to chase down those footnotes, that those scholars probably were saying, well, they used it, but he didn't use it a lot. He used it, but he didn't use it the way the Valentinians did. All of it would be a critical acknowledgement that there's Gnostic language here, but not that Ignatius was a Gnostic, which nobody believes.
So in your handout, Jerome, the first point is basically that in Christology, the nature of the work of Christ is moving us towards attaining to God and becoming like him. So there seems to be a hint of conditionality built in. That's his moralistic. And then with justification, it's the incompleteness of justification, echoing what Ken was just saying, that there's something that's done, but it's a process. Justification's a process. So again, when you have a process, then the question of the human in the process seems to be contrary to the kind of grace that he wants to propose. And then when we look at ecclesiology, the nature of the church, say a little bit about the church. We've been looking at, I think, the Christology and the justification piece. So how does Ignatius's understanding of ecclesiology fall short of what Torrance would like to express grace?
Well, Torrance understands Ignatius to be saying that the bishop has a special grace upon him, such that grace is channeled through the bishop, that the bishop is the equivalent of the Old Testament prophets. So there's this trickle down and institutionalized grace that's subject to the control of the bishop, that kind of thing. Essentially, the issues that Luther had with the late medieval Catholic Church, Torrance is finding here already. Young Torrance is finding these in Ignatius. Later on, when we get to the Trinitarian faith, we find that Torrance actually distances himself from that interpretation. But we haven't really covered Ignatius's doctrine of justification completely here. Torrance sees Ignatius as advocating justification as a process that's incomplete. I would suggest that Ignatius's own language of justification does not necessarily suggest that justification itself is a process. He uses dikaiomai twice here. One of them in his epistle to the Romans 5, verse 1, the soldiers guarding him mistreat him, even though he treats them well. And Ignatius says, yet because of their mistreatment, I am becoming more of a disciple. Nevertheless, I am not thereby justified. And actually, that language does show up in Paul in 1 Corinthians 4:4, where he says, Paul himself says, even though his conscience is not clear, he's not thereby justified. So Ignatius is actually using this term in a Pauline manner here. It's also unclear. I know Bart Ehrman's translation of this passage renders this justification in the past tense, that I have not been justified by their mistreatment. I am already justified, but it's not coming about due to their mistreatment or my response to their mistreatment. So there's at least the possibility that Ignatius is in fact using justification of himself to refer to an already past event there. And then the other time that he uses the term justify is, let's see, here in Philadelphians 8, verse 2, where he says, I want through your prayers to be justified, referring to his future, his death. Now, the context here is very clearly making a contrast between Judaizing and then the grace and faith and justification that come through Christ, which sounds a lot like Galatians. But the future tense of justification here is different than Paul's usual manner of referring to justification. It does show up, however, in Matthew 12, verse 37. And as I point out there, we know that, or it certainly looks like Ignatius is familiar with that passage because he's quoted from a few verses earlier, or alluded to a few verses earlier, Matthew 12, verse 33, in his letter to the Ephesians. So this type of language where he veers from Paul's usage, it does still square with Matthew's usage.
So it's still validly New Testament, even though it's not holding to Paul the judge. Has a broader canon within the canon, at least.
Right. And he appears to be synthesizing Paul and Matthew, which, is a laudable goal.
It is. And Matthew, sometimes feels a bit legalistic. So, I mean, if there's a gospel that has issues of legalism, it would be Matthew probably. And what does one do with that eye? Do you pluck it out or not? Or, what does this all mean? Mm-hmm. So the cautionary notes towards legalism, I can see where Matthew would be for Torrance, maybe a concern. If you're going to the Jewish legalistic side, it could conform to some of his ideals of Catholic legalism, echoing forms of legalistic Judaism.
Right. But what's striking though is it's in this very context where Ignatius is deliberately contrasting Christianity with Judaism and contrasting the grace of Jesus Christ, the salvation that comes through faith in Christ, with the Judaizers of his day.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also interesting when you were noting the bishop, the church, and all that. These are the themes of Zizulus's doctorate, right? That the nature of the church is the bishop, the Eucharist, the participation of the ecclesia, which is only valid when there is a bishop that can then oversee the Eucharistic experience. And so the question, when did Torrance meet Zizulus, and to what degree was there some concern of Zizulus here that he's pushing back against those Eastern Orthodox things that seem to have a naming of Jesus as the head of the church, but it really, if you don't have the bishop and the bishop can't do the Eucharist, then you've missed something, because the Eucharist makes the church and the bishop makes the Eucharist. So I can see where there would be a resistance to some of those themes potentially, but I don't know when Zizulus, that conversation would have begun and what concerns might have been there.
Right. I think, Ken and some of the others can clarify this further probably, but I'm thinking it would have been the 70s into the 80s
Yeah, so he wouldn't have met, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I don't know, between Dwayne and Bryden, who had your hand up first there? Bryden says it's Dwayne. Dwayne, go first.
Yeah, I was just picking up what you were saying there, Marty. That's what I was looking for, because every time I read this stuff, I got a problem with it, because when we looked at Zulus at Region, Jim would get us to read the first chapter because he does a really good job in his book on being as communion, and as an ontological reality. He helps you understand the Trinity and the relationship of the person, and just prosopon and putting on face where characters and not yet see the real. But the whole problem where the idea where the one person represents the church and he's not Christ, you got a problem. And that how, because to me it's like the metaphor of eclipse, or even just the word antichrist doesn't mean against Christ, it means in place of Christ. And you've got this situation here where the church gets leveled and the supernatural gets reduced to be administered at the earthly level, where you forget about the transcendent reality. And that's sort of part of our problem today, where we don't have an interconnection between the spiritual reality and the physical and how it all fits together. And they're struggling with that same problem there. And they it's like above or below. Well, you're too far below, man. It's not, that's, your below is obscuring your understanding of the reality that's interpreted from the layer above you, telling you what everything below, Christ sitting on the throne, what it means. He doesn't have a good interpretation of that, and how grace actually imparts to the whole world and the whole creation and new creation.
Yeah, I think that Zazulus would like to believe in the Eastern Orthodox tradition that there's almost a Polanyian sense that one indwells the Eucharist, one indwells the icon, so that you're participating in, which Zazulus uses the word the eschaton, not as the end of times. It is the reigning of Christ now, and all creation and all of heaven participates in the Eucharistic event. So the language of participation is something he would like to be there, and that there are facilitating events and persons, meaning the church gathered around the Eucharist and the episcopos, bishop, but they wouldn't want the separation to be there. So, I mean, I think that would be the pushback that Zazulus would give, and there are other reasons to push back. That wasn't the biggest thing that Torrance pushed back against Zazulus on. It was the Father is the source was the biggest thing. So the whole question of the nature of worship, Eucharist doesn't show up in a sense in this as a predominant thing. It's proper teaching, false teachers, schisms based on teaching that become a focal point in the breakdown of the unity that would show that grace is present, right? Grace is being in agreement almost. And so that it doesn't have these, what would be traditional liturgical forms of unity, is maybe an interesting thing. So for Torrance, there is something clearly in his third level of strata, that there's a sense in which the Trinity doctrinally is the Trinity, but if we don't participate in the life of that Trinity, then something is missing. I've heard people criticize Zazulus for just taking concepts of communion and all that it's not really arising from the nature of theology itself. But it seems as though Ignatius does have a sense of the Trinitarian life of God in unity, and that the church only by Christ participates in that. Maybe I'm overreading because I want to see it, but it seems like Ignatius does have a Trinitarian sense to what it is that he's doing, that says that grace does have some source in the Trinitarian life of God, in which we are beneficiaries and participants, maybe.
Yeah, and how are we participants was the question that Torrance puts to Ignatius. He says the whole early church agreed on the Trinity. It was so pleasing to have him say, we don't need to worry about whether or not Ignatius is a good, solid, reliable Trinitarian.
Yeah.
He's not a monarchist. He's not a dualist. He's a good, solid Trinitarian. Boom, he's there. But
Good.
That just is doctrine of the Trinity and Christology. It is not yet a doctrine of the atonement. This is and this is at the point where he says that Ignatius and several others grab for concepts of purity, concepts of stainlessness, biblical concepts, but then they try to say that if we don't have unity in the congregation, we don't have purity in the congregation. If you are not participating in a congregation, you don't have purity. You are stained. You need to be destained in order to rejoin the community. They're working for this sense of the pragmatics of church unity, which, because he's got this notion that the only way we can hold everything together in a nice hierarchy is if everybody be in the hierarchy and the holy ones be at the top. So if you break that unity, you've lost your holiness, you've lost your purity, you've lost your unity. So stick by the bishop.
You've lost the theological laundromat.
Yeah, and it come 600, 700 years later, then when people begin to say, essentially, we're going to excommunicate you because you are not obedient enough. To the point where people are being excommunicated for failing to bring gifts to the altar and give them to the deacons. That whole, once the power to include is transferred from Jesus, the Lord of inclusion, to the church and becomes the property of the church to do with as it wills, then there's no grace left. It's all law. But that is a point everybody wants to make, and it's a fine old standard criticism, Lutheran and Calvinist, against the Catholic Church. Looking at how integral, and that's the point Tom is trying to make here, how integral to Ignatius's theology, unity with the bishop, unity with the church, and unity with Jesus, and Jesus' unity with God is how all the blessings are mediated. You break that unity at any point, you're out. That sets up centuries of controversy about the power of the church to administer itself and discipline itself and communicate and excommunicate. But the young looking at it.
I'm going to jump over to Bryden here, but thank you. Those are great insights, and I think you're right on. Go ahead, Bryden.
Three things, actually, but they all come together. First of all, Ignatius does talk about the blood being the sap in the vine. Now, what's the metaphor doing? I think you can't use the word blood without thinking of the word Eucharist as well. That said, I'll move on. There is a very important distinction being made, and McPartland himself talks about it in his The Eucharist Makes the Church, when he's talking, about Zizioulas in connection with, oh gosh, was it a de Lubac or somebody? I can't remember. Some Catholic guy anyway. And the interesting thing is, we have a problem, because when we immediately do the obverse, which is the church makes the Eucharist, which is the classic Roman position, we interpret it, we hear it with the Latin heresy in mind, with all the instrumentalism that Torrance will bring to bear, and I think correctly bring to bear, which is quite a medieval thing. I don't think it's quite that early, Ken, but anyway, it's quite a medieval thing, and that's the problem. But sociologically, which is my third thing, again, we've got to immerse ourselves into these things that Jerome has said. We've got scattered Christian communities everywhere. Mm-hmm. And with respect, they don't all have a single bishop and presbyters under him. No. Back to Alistair Stewart. I've posted on that already. You might have a spokesperson for the presbyterate, which is the collection of episcopoi. That's his thesis, Alistair Stewart's thesis, that you have the spokesperson, which is Clement in Rome, and maybe Ignatius in Antioch, although Stewart, in fact, looks at Corinth more than Antioch. He looks at Alexandria as well. Now, the point is this. How many bishops were there in Syria? We don't know. I do know how many bishops Cyprian had in North Africa, 221, because in one of his synods, 219 said, yes, we're with you, Cyprian, and 2 abstained. What is this? It's the sociology of the place that determines that the bishop presides at Eucharist, and there are hundreds of bishops, and therefore hundreds of Eucharists being celebrated. And therefore, when you have Ignatius doing his language, the sociological lens is required, I think, to say, hey, there are lots of us. Oh, and yes, there's one who will be the spokesperson for the collection of episcopoi, which Stuart is saying is the presbyterate, as a group, a collective now. And I think our problem is that we're immediately hearing the Eucharist makes the church versus the church makes the Eucharist as being a clash of some sort, which it is. But what's the sociology? Is it the medieval apparatus of instrumentalized grace through sacred means and people, which is what Torrance will do much later? I mean, it's theology and reconciliation stuff, his essays there. Or is it something that is primarily something very early, something 2nd century, where you have gatherings of little people in little communities, each with their bishop? And I think we've got to actually kind of do a little bit of a rinse here, to pun with that word that you used. Because when we do that, suddenly Ignatius can be read slightly differently. Yes, the Catholics want to use him for their stuff, but that's just another kind of imposition. But that's enough again from me.
Yeah,
Very good.
and all that Torrance says is he was heading off in that direction. I mean, I would have wound him back like a fish on a line, but he headed off in that direction, and I hadn't been born yet. So that's a fair caution to Torrance's main thesis, that unless you get the doctrine of grace right, all these little heading off in directions are going to show up, whether it's about the hierarchy, about the Eucharist, or about baptism. You're going to end up all over the map, because the one who is holding it all together, the one true priest, the one true
Jesus.
Jesus, no, Lord
That's
of the
Jesus in
church,
action.
it's going to all fall apart. And Tom would many times say, I went to a huge worldwide communion service, and they had a round tables with pie wedges heading in towards the center, because they could not agree on the fundamental doctrine of the sacrament, so that only one person need preside. They needed multiple presiders, each one of a different flavor. And so you went to the pie wedge closest to your own denominational tradition, and that's the way you did it. Right, and that's your 200 and some bishops problem. It's 2,000 years later, and we still haven't solved the problem. So at least everybody agrees. When Tom says, oh, I think it's a problem, we can say, you're right, it is a problem.
On the table of King, what was his name? King Richard, the Knights of the Round Table, it said, in
We are
serving
free.
each other, we are free.
Mm.
In serving, and maybe it's in serving Christ, we are free, would be a better thing here. If everybody's serving their tradition, that's problematic. Dwayne, I see that hand.
Yeah, actually, just commenting on the idea of the church, how it has its ontological reality. You know, I have problems with the word Eucharist, because the Eucharist sort of hijacked the language of the New Testament, because both Paul and Peter used the word agape. It's the agape community expression. You know, and what's missing in the background here is the fact that Christ walks amongst the golden candlesticks. All those little communities that Bryden's talking about that we need to be aware of, they're all these little candlesticks that God is not absent. Jesus never abandoned us. He said he'd be with us right to the end of the age, as well as through all space and time. He'd never fail us nor forsake us. And again, this is where holding together the supernatural, because we can never substitute for Jesus. We get to represent him, but we will never substitute for him as the high priest of the order of Melchizedek. And as soon as you have anything, whether it's your big head or eyelash, anything that obscures the light shining truly as it is, you miss the point. You know, because this unapproachable glory that God dwells in, and we're participating in, we're called together in fellowship, it's supernatural, and it's beyond time, in time, and it's we've lost the meaning of that. And that's why we go back. It's a central act of worship, because even with Ignatius and the way he's understanding things, he still doesn't have this cosmic reality. He has the language with the words, but the words are missing the interconnectedness, like Ken's saying, where, because unless you have a doctrine of atonement, you might as well be Jewish, because you cannot understand the once penalty paid for all, that God died, all have died, because he lives, we all live. Don't treat men according to the former way, but now that you're in the spirit, you look like there's a whole new reality of new creation that's opened up, and there's a bit of obscurity in the way that these early fathers are aware of it. They're dealing with their own social problems, but agape and that community fellowship with the meal and the typology, or that's part of the Jewish tradition there, that there's things we're missing there, and I think Ignatius is missing that stuff too.
Yes, there's so much to be clarified, isn't there? Which I'm going to take us on into the exegetical section here.
Yeah, yeah.
And so to say there is a lesser section of this chapter on the exegetical, but it's worth noticing that he does actually engage the text. So the first section, which is quite long, he's wanting to give a brief overview of his basic problem about the understanding of grace that is there, and in the end, we're going to have some pushback by Jerome as to whether he understood it or even stayed with his criticisms here, but we'll save that till the end. So in the exegetical section, he engages 6 of the 7 letters that are traditionally listed as the letters of Ignatius, and he spends more time in the first ones than he does in the last. He kind of gets shorter as he goes on, kind of saying, I think I made my point.
Yeah.
So to particularly look at Ephesians and the Magnesians, give us a little sense of what he says there in the text, Jerome, and we'll see what else there might be to say of the others, but he's making his big points right up front. So,
right. So with regard to Ephesians, he points out charis appears a couple of times. One time sounds very biblical. It's God's forbearing will, God's patience towards us, that kind of thing. But then the second time that it's used, Torrance thinks that charis is being thought of as an inner power or force that's closely bound up with the church. And so there again, you have this early Catholic critique, this idea that grace has been depersonalized, has been separated from Christ, made into some sort of mana type power, magic power that's connected with the church and is wielded by the church.
Charismatics. The charis has become a charismatic power almost that has been transferred to the human.
Yeah, or like the Force in Star Wars. Yeah, that kind of idea.
Yeah.
So that's his critique there in Ephesians. Once you get into Magnesians, and I have notes on that in the handout, he believes that Magnesians chapter 8, the first couple of verses, sounds a lot like an infused grace, and that the bishops have the same sort of special grace power as the Old Testament prophets. And so in the notes there, I point out that Brian Arnold has pushed back against Torrance's, number one, against Torrance's belief that the bishops are being compared specially with the prophets here, when in fact elsewhere Ignatius compares the prophets with the whole of the New Testament church. They were saved by grace through faith, looking ahead towards Christ, just as we Christians as a whole, not just the bishops, are saved by grace through faith, looking back to Christ. So Brian Arnold challenges Torrance's equation of the position of the prophets in the Old Testament and bishops in the present church. But then secondly, Arnold wants to stress that that Ignatius is contrasting Judaism and Christianity, the salvation by grace through faith of Christianity, with keeping the law in Judaism. And that, of course, is a very Pauline point to make. So Arnold does not see any sort of gratia infusa here.
So he thinks that Torrance got it wrong.
Yeah.
And what do you think?
Well, again, I can understand how, and Torrance cites, where is it here? I just ran across it, where Torrance cites Harnack by name in the text, in the body of the text here. I've lost it again, but at any rate, it is certainly correct, as Ken has pointed out, that as these ideas progress through the centuries, they develop, they get distorted. I don't think that any denomination or theological tradition is invulnerable to that. So the fact that a particular set of ideas gets distorted over time does not automatically mean that the original conception or use of terms is flawed. It just means because of total depravity and some other things, humans tend to misunderstand and warp and twist and abuse any good thing. So I would be very cautious. Frankly, the whole idea that people who are contemporaries of the apostles or near contemporaries of theirs somehow entirely lost or virtually entirely lost the teaching of the apostles on the subject of grace for pretty much 2,000 years strikes me as on the surface implausible. That's the kind of, when I deal with Jehovah's Witnesses, when I deal with Mormons, that's the kind of claims that they make that I have to push back against them on. And so I'm highly uncomfortable with thinking that Ignatius just completely misunderstood Paul.
Mm-hmm. So I'm processing your comment about Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Can you say a little bit more about that? How you engage them and how that relates to this comment?
Right. Well, not necessarily with the doctrine of grace for them, but for Jehovah's Witnesses, they're going to claim that essentially the proper Arian understanding of Jesus' relationship to God was progressively and largely lost very early on. I mean, Ignatius would be a prime example of a second century falling away from the apostles' pristine Arianism for them, because Ignatius clearly has a very high Christology, equates Jesus with God. And so there'd be a second century falling away for Jehovah's Witnesses. For Mormons, there's the idea that essentially as soon as the apostles died, the special gifts that were given to the church, the keys, that many plain and precious truths, as Joseph Smith speaks of them, were lost to the church until Joseph Smith came along. And Torrance is in danger of that same sort of radical decline model, where, as he says, he thinks that the apostolic doctrine of grace was lost, except for Augustine got a few things right. He sort of kind of helped to restore it a little bit. The reformers kind of sort of restored it, but he's not willing to say that either Augustine or the reformers really got it right.
Yeah.
And so apparently until Bart, all was in Catholic darkness.
Right. Maybe P.T. Forsyth and McIntosh. I mean, there may have been a few others who we could throw in there, but yeah. So to say that Torrance is truly trying to be a doctor for the church, and he's just trying to clarify in his doctorate that if you get grace wrong, meaning making about the human in any way progressing or having a perfecting process or goal, then there is a sickness that will creep into the church itself. And that central point of doctrine basically is pointing to the fact you've departed from Christ at some level. You have cut yourself off and become dependent upon human effort. Is that, as a doctor, what Torrance is kind of doing?
Well, that's my concern. In Galatians, Paul is very clear, and you're referring to Paul's language there in Galatians, that you who are trying to be justified by works of the law have cut yourselves off from grace. Well, if we take that seriously, and then we take seriously Torrance's claim that virtually nobody got it right over 2,000 years, from the generation after the apostles until Bart, that that leaves precious few saved people.
Right.
If they're being saved by having a correct understanding of words, then yeah, they're lost. But if they're being saved by grace, they're being saved even though they don't understand it.
Right, except that Paul's language in Galatians is, you who are trying to be justified by works of the law have cut yourselves off from grace.
No.
So,
right. And Bart is quite gracious with his grace, but even Bart will correct the title of Berkouwer's book, The Triumph of Grace, and say, no, it's the triumph of Jesus in the theology that needs to be pointed out. And I think that TF wants to go in that direction, but even the nature of, well, it's the whole thing of, ask Karl Barth, Karl Barth says, the answer is Jesus. What was your question?
right, yeah.
The questions are all important that one would ask. How does grace work? Well, it works because of Jesus. What is atonement? Well, atonement is because of the person of Jesus, who he is towards us as the elected and the rejected. I mean, the fullness of the way Jesus plays these things out is going to be important for Bart. And I think those are sub-themes down the road for Torrance, that at this point, maybe he is sufficiently engaged in the linguistic game, so to speak, that the full-bodied wine coming to its full is not there yet. As I think you're going to say at the end, he develops into something that really has more appropriate kinds of outworkings. And here where maybe we can say he's wrestling with it overconfidently, maybe, but we'll at least grant him the process.
Yeah, the reality is, the old slogan is, when you do doctoral research, you spend 3 years trying to learn to think like your supervisor, and then the next 30 years trying to learn to think differently.
We're only halfway through the book. We really don't know where Tom's going to end up. I'm throwing out some clues here. Jerome's throwing out some clues. I would point out that when you talk about the Constantinian fall of the church, that's a modern concept. People are still talking that way. They've been talking that way since before the Reformation, and they're still talking about it. That something happened when the church became the religion of the empire, it became the fall of the church, and it's been fallen ever since. What everybody now has to be able to convince one another is what are the people who are trying to be sincere Christians doing day in, day out, morning, noon, and night to, as it were, redeem the time, because the text has not been lost. We're all sitting around going, did Ignatius understand Romans? Did Ignatius understand Galatians? But nobody sat around burning up copies of Romans and Galatians and holding on to their copies of Ignatius. Ignatius got pushed to the side eventually. Romans is still being read. Galatians is still being, and Corinthian, and all the New Testament canon is still the canon. It has not been pried open and stuff pulled out or other stuff stuffed in. That is something that needs to be accounted for.
Yeah. And those books are changing the world. And ultimately, Bart and Torrance are going to build on those in very significant ways. Dwayne, I see that hand.
Yeah, I just get back to the point here about knowledge. I think that's fundamentally the problem. is that knowledge passes away. We know in part and see in part. And that's the fundamental problem. We're not going to be saved by how smart we are. Even knowledge, we're judged more harshly because we should have known better. And then what type of knowledge do you know? Do you know from experience, or is just you abstracting and detaching it from reality? See, a lot of our understanding, Mike Habits told me, said, if you can't teach it, you don't know it. And how do you know it? By doing it. And that's that the truth will set you free. And how do you know the truth? By doing it. You know where it comes from. And that's part of the problem, because we know in part and see in part, and it's again, so you got to give the guy some grace as well. But all these ideas have consequences, because they're not just unsharp knives, so to speak, because the truth is a sharp two-edged knife. And if you believe that's the truth, it cuts deeply in the impact on the church and the understanding. Because again, how does his understanding eclipse the mediation of Christ, that we all know we have a personal relationship yet together? How do you show love through this personal relationship? You can't see God who you don't know, it's through loving those whom you do see, and so the fundamentals are still there. And the reality is that there's only one man who judges us all. He knows exactly everything. So whether we're right or wrong, it doesn't really amount to too much. It's like Jesus saves. That's just the answer. Like Bart would say, or any other, that's the answer.
Yeah. And there is a maturity in the whole process. When love does its work, it matures us and our theologies, and we do act because we actually believe it in the whole of our being, and not just in theory at some level. So I'm going back to your outline here.
No.
You had a comment here. Where was it?
I think we were ready for Ephesians 17.
Okay, so go with that.
Okay. Here in Ignatius's epistle, Ephesians 17:2, he ties together charisma, charis, and dunamis, power, and knowledge. And so Torrance comments here, we have here, therefore, the idea of charis as inspired potency, producing gnosis, a doctrine which plays such an important part in Gnosticism, and in such Christian theology has been strongly influenced by Gnosticism, such as Clement of Alexandria. But of course, in Paul, in the Pauline writings, you have these terms used and correlated together in ways that are not Gnostic. And so the fact that Ignatius correlates these terms doesn't necessarily show a Gnostic influence at that point. And in fact, he sounds a lot like Paul, right? We need to become wise by receiving God's knowledge, which is Jesus Christ. The knowledge of God is Jesus Christ. So cue 2 Corinthians, about how we've received the light of the knowledge of God in the face of Jesus Christ, or cue 1 Corinthians, that in him, he is our wisdom from God, and and the power of God. The wisdom of God and the power of God is Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So I mean, you're saying again, TF is overreading something, cautious eyes, and missing the correlation that could be read in between two Ephesian letters, and then of course Corinth is not that far from Ephesus. So the letter passing here. Have there been people who have done work between Paul's Ephesian letter and the Ephesian letter of Ignatius?
I don't know about that, but I do know Michael Holmes, who is a scholar of the Apostolic Fathers, is insistent that Ignatius does know 1 Corinthians.
Okay.
No.
Right.
I was intrigued to see that there's a Hermeneia volume on Ignatius of Antioch.
Yeah.
It's not part of the canon, but part of the Apostolic Fathers. He gets his own book, and those are really good commentary series. I wanted to follow up on the last thing, and it's pages 88 and 89, where Torrance points out that it is Ignatius is talking to the church, to the bishops of the church, and to the presbyters of the church. He's not talking to the world. He's not talking to the skeptics. He's not talking to the people out of the agora. He's not, his own, Torrance is suggesting that because he's talking about the only, it's the job of the bishop to keep the church pure. He only talks to other bishops. Has already limited or put a qualifier on his understanding of ecclesiology and missionology, because he has nothing to say to the world. The whole New Testament concept of Jesus is the missionary to the world is simply not there, which he takes as something that needs to be pointed to when evaluating Ignatius in his role as an apostolic father.
And that Grace
Yes.
does the missionary work.
And
Right.
I do push back against that. There, once I quote Torrance's closing lines,
Mhm.
I point out that Ignatius exhorts Polycarp to exhort all people so that they may be saved. This is in his letter to Polycarp, chapter 1, verse 2. In Philadelphians 11, verse 1, some of Ignatius's Christian companions were treated badly. But he goes on to say, may those who dishonored them be redeemed by the grace of Jesus Christ. And then in Smyrnans 4, verse 1, he tells the congregation, don't have fellowship with heretics, nevertheless do pray for them, that somehow they might repent, difficult though it may be. But Jesus Christ, our true life, has power over this. So I think that there is, even though Ignatius is focused on the health of these particular churches and their relationship to their bishops, he never forgets about the wider world that's out there. And he sees the unity in faith and love of these congregations as being the means of witnessing to the world. And frankly, if we're going to ding Ignatius on that score, we might point out that Paul's letters, and in fact, most of the letters of the New Testament, don't really say a lot about Christians actively, presenting four spiritual laws or evangelism explosion to their neighbors. They're concerned with the quality of life that Christians are living, and by that quality of life, by their fellowship together, by their lifestyle, they will draw people towards Christ.
There are themes of, I think of Paul in Colossians saying, let your words be seasoned with salt, as it were, so you may know how to respond to each person, that there's a learned sensitivity of how one engages in this reaching out that requires attentiveness and using your grace words and things like that, right? And not using words that confuse, but rather the words themselves reflect a love that is the outworking of everything that kind of is in chapter 3 of what a church love, which is the perfect bond of unity for the church, also I think becomes an expression to the nature of reaching out to the community as well. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting, these whole questions of, one, how Torrance is trying to correct something that maybe is being wrestled with, but these, the New Testament, the Old Testament, there is a seed sense in all of it. They are not pleroma. They are not fullness even in of themselves. Karl Barth's statement, we don't merely want to ask, what did they say, but what do we say because of what they said, is kind of the question for Torrance. What do we say about grace now because of what both the original writers as well as what Ignatius is saying? How do we continue to form in a language that makes sense in our time in ways that are missionary? These are appropriate unfoldings. And again, that's probably what you're probably going to talk about in this final section, which we might just take you to that part where you say the mature TFT on Ignatius and the church. So give us the corrective and the hope, and then what we say because of what we have done in reading this section. What do we say now more astutely?
Right. So it is interesting. And again, I've gone through some of this process myself. I did my doctoral research, I wrote my thesis, and then as I have the chance to do further reflection, as I get pushback, as I read more and all that, I don't necessarily agree with everything that I wrote then.
Yeah.
You move on, you develop in your own thinking. And so we certainly, it's interesting, in the middle of his studies, when young Torrance took a break and went to Auburn Seminary for a year, we have his published lectures, theology lectures, and in his foreword to those lectures, Alistair McGrath had really wanted those to be published. And so Torrance writes about how his early lectures on theology at Auburn were rough-hewn and jejune. And so I wonder, if he were to go back as someone who maybe retired from New College and write a new foreword to the Doctrine of Grace and the Apostolic Fathers, what he might say about that. But what we do have is when he published the Trinitarian Faith, he says,
1990, first published in 88, so we're talking 30 years, 40 years later.
yes, but the lectures themselves were given in 1981.
Okay,
It just took him a while to prepare them for publication.
so 30 some years.
Yeah. But in there, I looked up every time he refers to Ignatius. And so you have the list there of what he has to say. Notice the first thing he says is, and this is in the chapter on ecclesiology, specifically, he's walking through the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed. I believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and he's spelling that out. So he says, although for the purpose of preserving the empirical oneness of the church in the face of heretical dissension, Ignatius kept pointing to the bishop as the focal point of unity. Ignatius clearly thought of the church's relation to Christ as overarching everything else. So here he appears to be walking back some of his suggestion in his dissertation that grace had become the property of the bishop as almost this supernatural force exercised by the bishop to keep the church together.
Yeah.
And then again, the next quote there, he says, this conception of the bishop did not carry with it the idea that the church over which the bishop presided was endowed with the grace of the Holy Spirit as a possession to be dispensed under his authority, far less the idea that the bishop himself constituted the link between Christ and the faithful. So here the mature Torrance is, again, revising the claims of, or the perception of a sort of early Catholic viewpoint within the Ignatian ecclesiology.
Yeah, is carefully saying Ignatius could have appeared in Calvin's Institutes along with Jerome and other pre-Reformation Catholic writers criticizing later Catholic developments. Right here he's saying that you will not find in Ignatius the claims of the medieval papacy. It's simply not supported. And Calvin delighted to be able to cite Jerome to say, look, this is the sacrament as Jerome knew it, and it's not the Roman Mass. This is the structure of the church in Palestine and in Asia and Asia Minor in the first 3 centuries, and it is not the monarchical papacy of the Middle Ages. So he's just saying, hey, there it is. I'm going to cite Ignatius, and I'm going to cite Jerome and Augustine and anybody else just to make these points.
Right.
I did notice how the young Torrance complains that Ignatius is being ambiguous. And when it gets to certain key places, he talks about, oh, well, it's a mystery, and it's dazzling. And I can't go on much further here, and as if that's a cop-out. And then when it's later, it becomes important to Tom to be able to say, well, I didn't say that quite clearly enough. I guess I was a little ambiguous. Let me mine some more material from the Chalcedonians and see what more we can do. It's a very old thing. Even the Anabaptists of the Reformation era did that kind of thing, to criticize the corruptions of the medieval church.
Right. And it's noteworthy as well. Ignatius, everywhere in his writings, when he's telling the congregations to be subject to the bishop's authority, the authority of the bishop, the presbytery, and the deacons, that sort of thing, he everywhere assumes that the bishops, the presbyters, the deacons are men of godly character who are faithful to the apostolic teaching.
Yeah.
So he nowhere has the idea that we should just blindly be subject to anybody just because of their position, regardless of their moral character or their doctrine.
It almost gets a bit saccharine. He leads off most of his letters with a wonderful praise of the purity and the unity and the peace of the church he's addressing. And I only bring this up. I'm not bringing it up because I heard anything wrong. I'm bringing it up because I've heard only the right things, and that kind of, it gets a bit saccharine after a while. You go, can you kind of tone it down? Because if I walk into my presbytery, I do not see an assemblage of people in sweet, perfect unity with one another. It's hammer and tong most of the time.
You know, that reminds me, Ken, since you bring that up, because just recently I have had some multiple interactions with East Asian Christians.
Ah.
And that sort of what can strike some of us as very saccharine and melodramatic, overly flattering, that kind of thing, is just what it means to be polite in an East Asian culture. And so I wonder how much of that may play in here as well.
Tom tries to say that here it's because of his ecclesiology which he is reading between the lines of all of this flattering, not flattering. He's just saying, this wonderful glowing review of the quality of the episcopate in everywhere he goes. I said, isn't that remarkable and amazing? Unfortunately, it's my cynicism and my Calvinism that says, let me get in there with my Calvinist dipstick and see if I can find some innate depravity somewhere here. The other element I noticed in almost all of the letters is, like almost every other line, he says, pray for this, pray for this. Pray. It almost never is it gather up a collection and build a new church, or we need a worthy work of something or another. The only power anybody has is to pray. And he will say, because you prayed for me, I was released. You prayed for my church in Antioch, and now they have peace. He believes in the power of prayer, but because he's at it all the time. And I have no reason to disbelieve that is in fact a major piece of his piety. But it's striking to see how often it comes up.
Dwayne, did you want to get something in before we end here?
Yeah. Just one last note there, because I'm thinking in the back of my mind there that the message to the church of Ephesus, that they knew how to separate the apostles, but they lost their first love, and connecting faith and love to the missing grace there, that somehow I think Christ really put his thumb on the problem. That that's still a corrective, whether we want to try and defend Ignatius or not, because we still have to learn to transmit the gospel a little bit more appropriately and more authentically. And like, he's a person that we can learn from, both for good and for bad, and we're all in the same boat. How do we transmit the message?
Yeah, good. So Jerome, give us a final statement. How should we think about this chapter about Torrance? I mean, this is a Torrance reading group, so we want to think some about the nature of Ignatius, but how do we learn with Torrance and beyond Torrance? How do we take this and learn ourselves going on?
Right. I'd say, first of all, kudos to him for actually taking the time to read the Apostolic Fathers. And it would certainly be valuable in our church groups to explore that more. I was actually, when I lived in Iowa, there was an Eastern Orthodox mission to Pella, Iowa, which, if anybody knows, that's a Dutch Reformed town. So it was interesting to have a Greek Orthodox mission to Pella, Iowa. But one of the things that the priest there did was that he had a study of the Apostolic Fathers, where evangelicals might have a Bible study, community Bible study, or something like that. He had a study of the Apostolic Fathers and was able to bring people in who hadn't been exposed to that. We had a Lutheran, we had me as a Wesleyan, we had various others there, all studying the Apostolic Fathers together. And so it would behoove us, as we have the opportunity in our congregations, in our academic settings, whatever, to introduce our people to the Apostolic Fathers, certainly. So that would be one positive thing. Another thing is that whether or not you agree with young Torrance's diagnosis of these materials, you have to say we can appreciate how keen he is to focus on the grace of God in Jesus Christ and not water that down, not reduce that to some kind of impersonal spiritual force, not to reduce that to something that the church controls, something that's divorced from the person of Jesus. So, kudos to him for his theology of grace, even if we question his reading of Ignatius, at least. And then thirdly, the fact that he does change his mind over time. And from my perspective, he gets closer to a right reading of Ignatius over time. So that's good. He grows, he learns, and so should we all.
Very good. Well, Jerome, this has been wonderful. This is I think a rich chapter, but a difficult chapter in many ways because there's so much to engage here and to clarify. And so you have brought much wisdom, and I really appreciate the later reading and seeing that change that is there, and just the ability to bring a wealth of your own perspective to this. I think has been really, really helpful. So we do recognize this is young Torrance, and so we want to always keep growing and recognize the humility we always hope that we have and that others will give us grace in our mistakes and say, good job for being on the road to understanding in a way that I think you've affirmed that Torrance was really committed to then as well. And we want to just live within, that kind of committed heuristic journey to keep on discovering how grace works out. And if ever there was a time that needs it, we certainly live in one now where it's very important to discover any source of grace and also to recognize the ways that it gets confused. So thank you for the time, for the handout, for your commitment to these studies and making this a great session.
Thank you.
Very good. So we will let you go. And next week, I think I am going to be looking at one of the essays in Participatio. I hadn't assigned anything for next week. So the current edition of Participatio came out quite recently. So I will select one. If anybody wants to vote on one of those essays, let me know within 24 hours and I'll take your votes for the essay you would like to discuss within that new issue of Participatio. So for today, thank you all for being here and for the conversation, the things that you all brought to the conversation to make it a rich occasion. So blessings on you. Take care.
Cheers.